Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the seminar of the history of gardens and designed landscapes. My name is Jesse O'Neill, and I'm one of the seminar conveners. This is now the fourth session in our current term and our current theme, which is titled An Open Book, Gardens in Literature and Letters, which is dealing with representations of gardens and landscapes through the written and the printed word. This evening, our speaker is Nicolas Roth. Nicolas is the visual resources librarian for Islamic art and architecture in the Fine Art Library at Harvard University. He received a PhD from Harvard in South Asian Studies with expertise in Islamic visual and material culture, South Asian literature, and garden and landscape history. Beyond his academic work in the subject, Nicolas is also apparently an active gardener, which is done responding to his research. Today, Nicolas will be presenting his paper, A Defining Pair, Jasmine and Roses in the Literature of the Early Modern Persianate World. I would ask people throughout the talk, if you have questions to pose to Nicolas, please do feel free to write these into the comments. However, if you would also like to come on screen later on after the talk, feel free to raise your hand and we'll be we can address questions directly. But with that, I'll hand over to Nicolas. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am going to talk somewhat broadly in this presentation, in the sense that while I'm focusing on a fairly narrow topic, I'm sort of ranging more broadly in time and geography and literary traditions than I've done at other times in my work. And this is kind of intentional because I sort of, wanted to sort of explore a narrower range of in this case plants within the sort of larger topic of garden history and literature, but sort of trace it and explore its implications across sort of a broader swath of the literary traditions and geographic regions that my work both with texts and with the visual arts and with garden history engages with. So that is why I decided to talk specifically about jasmine and roses, and a lot of this talk will be about, sort of what exactly do those two plant names, quote unquote, those two terms encompass in the Persianate world, in the literatures of the early modern Persianate world. So, just to give a bit of a background, and throughout this talk, I'll sort of dip relatively shallowly into a number of different traditions. My apologies if you personally have a lot of familiarity or expertise with a particular language and its literary history or a particular place, and I don't get to discuss it in enough depth. Always happy to answer more questions later and discuss it further later. But I'm going to try and give a little bit of a geographic, literary, historical background to each place, so that we can at least sort of stitch them together and see some of the main connections. So this context of the Persianate world is essentially a sort of large cultural region historically defined by the use of the Persian language to varying degrees as a important medium of education and of courtly culture. At its greatest extent, it arguably sort of, is generally seen as sort of extending from the Balkans to Bengal, what is now Eastern India and Bangladesh, across sort of Southwestern Asia and Southeastern Europe, marked, and this particularly in the early modern period is primarily the area defined by the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid, and then later Qajar empires in Iran, and the Mughal Empire in South Asia. So, this is sort of in the period from the 16th to the 19th century, but the sort of formation of this larger cultural region really starts getting underway a few centuries earlier, in the 10th and 11th century, when after the Persophone sort of core of Iran and Central Asia having been largely converted to Islam by earlier Arab conquest, the sort of Persophone Persian using courtly culture starts spreading into northern India and to the east and into what would become Turkey, into Anatolia in the west. So most of what we'll be talking about today stems from within this region. However, I am also interested a little bit in how we, especially in the context of garden history, how we deal with the potential interplay or influence with regions further west in the Mediterranean or Islamic world. So in North Africa in particular, and the sort of Islamicate Mediterranean, because there is obviously a connection point with the broader Arab world, both in the sense that it was the Arab Islamic conquest that sort of formed the medieval Persian culture that is the bedrock of this Persianate world, including a lot of its literary forms and symbolism and so on. And as we'll see, the Jasmine and rose as literary symbols are arguably part of that and sort of go back and forth between the two connected cultural realms. But then also later, because the Ottoman Empire, which is at its core very much part of this Persianate world culturally, which does, study Persian literature and adheres to a sort of understanding of Persian courtly culture, does control a significant chunk of North Africa from the 17th through the 19th century, and does, even though it never quite achieves it, does try to sort of fully push to the western end of the Islamic world into what is now Morocco. So there is cultural exchange there as well. So that's just sort of a little bit of historic and geographic background to this idea of the Persianate. So to set us up with the sort of core tradition, I'm going to start with some verses from the sort of, what would be seen as sort of the really standard Persian poetic tradition, that have our defining pair, the rose and the jasmine. The first is not so much from an early modern poet, but actually from one that would be considered classical medieval poet, Attar Nishapuri, who as his name, his pen name Attar suggests that he was which is related to the word itero Otto, that he was a perfumer / pharmacist. The term generally in Iranian context now is used for sort of a traditional pharmacist or apothecary, but it also means perfumer. That's where it originally comes from, which already hints sort of at a close link, between the sort of, the herbalist and the medical, between the botanical, and the realm. But he is now known not for what apparently was his day job, but for being a prolific poet and Sufi, so Islamic mystical scholar. He's particularly well known for his Mantiq at-Tayr, the Conference of the Birds, which is sort of a lengthy poetic text in which a large group of birds essentially go on an adventure that is a metaphor for the soul's search for contact with the divine. I have not picked from that. Instead, I've just picked a couplet from a regular sort of romantic poem of his that's very typical of sort of mainstream Persian, medieval Persian poetry, which you can see here on the screen, and which reads Khiz ki bishkuft gul va yasemin tab bineshanim biham e ghulam, and which I translated as "Get up, for rose and jasmine have blossomed, so that we may sit together, dear boy." And this e ghulam, ghulam, I mean slave, pretty boy, servant, it's sort of it's an interesting and at times a bit challenging word in the tradition. Is the rhyme word of the poem, so it actually appears as the in every hemistich of the poem, it appears as the final two words. But here in its sort of most standard form, we see this pair, the Gul va Yasmin, rose and jasmine, and it is from the Persian Yasmin that our English word jasmine ultimately derives via Arabic. Really serve as a metonym for the garden and for spring. They are the two. What the poet really here is saying, and again, this is why this is a very straightforward verse, is look, the garden is in beautiful bloom. It's springtime. It's a time to enjoy being outside, and it's a time for romance. So get up and come, let's sit in the garden together. It's an invitation to romance at the seasonally appropriate time and in the appropriate place, both of which are indicated by these two flowers in their combination. And then I decided to pair this with another couplet from a similar poem, but roughly 3 centuries later, where the basic form is similarly straightforward, and the pair of jasmine and rose is used in a similar manner, but the sort of style and meaning of the poetry has gotten significantly more complicated, that the style has become more involved and the poem is really working on multiple levels. So this is by Zoib Tabrizi, who lived in the 17th century, and who, even though he was an Iranian poet and spent most of his career in Iran, like a lot of Persian-speaking poets,
something of a transatlantic political football. Because if Donald Trump does eventually turn off the
aid, we can hear the TV in the background. Thank you. Where was I? So he was an Iranian poet, but like many poets of that time, actually went to India to further his career, to seek patronage there. Unlike a lot of poets of this time period who did that and who sort of became famous enough that we have their works and that they're studied today, read today, he actually returned to Iran after spending some time at the Mughal court and then spending some time in Kabul and Kashmir, living with a family that he befriended, who members of which served as the Mughal governors of those two provinces, because both Kashmir and the northeast of what is now Afghanistan, but centered on Kabul, were provinces of the Mughal Empire at the time. But he eventually returned to Iran and became the poet laureate under Shah Abbas II, and spent his later life in the Iranian Safavid capital at Isfahan. He's known for his poetry being dense and clever. And while this is certainly not one of the complicated examples, just in this couple, we do see kind of how that stylistically has shifted. So he says, "Garisk khod zebuye gul va yasamin kuni, sanbur var khane pur as angabin kuni," which straightforward translation, which I give here: if you make your living from the scent of roses and jasmine, you fill the beehive with honey. So again, seems to be a simple image. The roses and jasmine just stand for flowers and for the garden. Here, though, there is a sort of more clever double meaning, as I've mentioned, in that metaphorically, the Zambur Khane, the beehive, is also an expression for a learned person or spiritual teacher. So this is actually also about the idea that if you learn the subtle things, if you learn the hidden meanings, the hidden understanding of things, then you're filling yourself or the person who does that fills themselves with sort of esoteric knowledge, represented by the honey filling the beehive. So this is the sort of classical Persian tradition, and it's sort of most regular use of rose and jasmine as a pair to represent these very fundamental ideas of garden and spring and flora that are really ubiquitous symbols in the poetry. From that, I wanted to move on to South Asia. And we're jumping just a little bit forward in time. So here we're in the early 18th century. I want to just briefly look at this painting, even though we're mostly talking about texts. I do like my visuals, because this is one of a whole series of paintings produced over the course of the 18th and early 19th century in a princely state known as Mewar, that constitutes part of the Indian state of Rajasthan, centered at the capital of Udaipur. And throughout this period, this court produced a lot of these panoramic paintings of sort of happenings of the court and of the city and of the surrounding countryside. And a particular favorite among those were these royal visits to a garden known as the Gulab Bari, the rose garden. And apart from just being really charming and having lots and lots of fascinating, beautiful detail, what's really distinctive about these is that this rose garden, rather than just being a decorative or recreational space, is quite obviously a productive space, essentially a rose farm. And what we can, we have the central part of the garden here where the royal entourage is sort of enjoying their spring excursion, is a field of damask roses, almost certainly grown to be made into rose water and to be used materially at the court to supply the court. And then at the upper right corner, there's actually a smaller but similar plot of jasmine. Not quite detailed enough to make it out, but since they're not trellised or anything, they're just sort of low-growing shrubs, most likely what is known as Arabian jasmine, Jasmine zambak, which is the most common jasmine most commonly used in things like garlands and so on in India even today. Also the jasmine used to flavor jasmine tea and so on. And we'll come back a little bit, or rather for quite a bit later on to the sort of many types of jasmine and also somewhat different types of roses that we're dealing with, especially in South Asia. But I just wanted to point this out as the sort of visual representation really of how connected this pairing is, and how connected it is in material culture at times in this sort of larger cultural region we're talking about. So starting us off in Indian traditions, literarily, I wanted to just quickly start with a verse from an Indic literary tradition, specifically a North Indian one, of a language or a dialect called Brajbhasha, which is now, generally treated as part of the literary history of Hindi, and to some degree Urdu. But what it really is kind of another literized dialect, another branch of the tree of North Indian vernacular languages. And as being seen in sort of an Indic literary history, it's generally seen as taking its literary cues and its vocabulary primarily from an older Indian Sanskrit source. But it, especially in these sort of early modern 18th century courtly contexts, it's also clearly part of this, larger Persianate context, both in terms of the forms and images it's trying to evoke, and in terms of sometimes even the vocabulary that it's using. So the verse that I picked here is by a poet that we actually know quite little about. His name was Somnath. He was a a court poet at the court of the Jat Rajas of Bharatpur, who are actually quite well known in particular for the garden complex, palace garden complex that they laid out at Deeg in northeastern Rajasthan. And that garden and palace still exist. And this is actually from his sort of description, an extended description of the town of Deeg and its palace and garden, where he sort of celebrates the achievement of the dynasty in creating this beautiful palace. And so he actually opens that saying that, and in the town a lake with beautiful gardens, blooming and fruiting in 4 parts, screw pine, rose, and poet's jasmine, and coiling upon the screw pine a vine, bitter orange, jasmine, and oleander, like fragrant jewels, wallflowers and corn poppies, sunflowers beside hibiscus, a heap of African marigolds, a splendid treasure of flowers and fragrance. And he goes into some more architectural details and then comes back to some other plants and so on. But you get the style of these sort of dense garden descriptions. But again, amongst our opening salvo, we have the rose and one part of jasmine, one type of jasmine, then a few other fragrant, pale colored flowers and another type of jasmine. So chameli and juhi here are in the original are 2 types of jasmine. And gulaba or gulab is the word he's using for rose, most likely specifically a damask rose, actually derived from gul and ab are actually rose and water in Persian. So rose water, the product made from damask roses rather than the rose themselves, but in North Indian languages, that word eventually comes to be used and is today for just rose for the plant. And the painting here to go along with it is from another Rajasthani court, also from the 18th century, from Kishangarh. And we have one of the rulers of that court, who was himself a very prolific Brajbhasha poet, Savan Singh, in a very Persianate sort of parterre of roses. And there are 2 barely visible women in the pavilion he's looking towards. One in the door, it's hard to make out, is holding a bouquet of pink roses. And the other one in the window behind a reed screen has a jasmine garland hanging from the window. And that then brings us to yet another tradition that is part of this cultural sphere, and that is Urdu poetry, which emerges is another literized sort of dialect of the North Indian vernacular continuum. Grammatically it's identical to modern Hindi. It's the 2 are differentiated by basically where they draw their cultured vocabulary, their educated vocabulary from, with Hindi generally going more towards Sanskrit for that, whereas Urdu goes to Persian and Arabic, although the Arabic usually filtered through Persian, and Urdu uses a version of the Persian script, Perso-Arabic script, whereas Hindi uses the Devanagari script, also used for Sanskrit and some other Indian languages. Urdu really takes over increasingly from Persian in North Indian educated circles in relatively late in the 18th century. And then in the 19th sort of becomes the language of large sections of the educated urban North Indian population. But during that time, already under colonial influence, especially, becomes increasingly associated specifically with Muslims, which is now one of the national languages, or besides English, the national language of Pakistan. And in India, it's the state language in a number of states where it's associated with the Muslim populations of those states. The Urdu poetic tradition is very beholden to Persian. It's the same, uses many of the same verse forms, the same meters, the same sort of genres, and it also imports a lot of the language of the poetic imagery and of the cultural references. Although the modern scholarship, I think, has often underplayed how much it actually also is aware of and draws on Indian or South Asian realities, in part because it becomes so closely linked to this idea of a sort of imported Islamic culture versus an indigenous one that is more Hindu inflected. But in this, we see the idea of rose and jasmine as a pairing used very similarly to what we saw in the two Persian verses we have seen. So the first one that I have here by a poet called Qalandar Bakhsh Jur'at, who was born in Delhi and then, like a lot of poets of his generation, later migrated to Faizabad and Lucknow, more in, further east, with, following the availability of patronage. Is the couplet that I allude to in the abstract for the talk, and it reads Jur'at khizan ke aate chaman mein raha na kuch ek regai zaban pe gulo yasman ki baat, which translates to Jur'at, when autumn came, nothing remained in the parterre, just talk of roses and jasmine remained on the tongue. So again, this idea that the garden is represented by, is encapsulated in this pair of rose and jasmine. And when spring and summer go away and the garden sort of becomes desolate or the garden disappears, it's only the memory of those that remain. And you can sort of see a melancholic vein that there certainly exists in the Persian tradition as well, but that really becomes a central concern in a lot of the later Urdu poetry. The second one that I chose is not a couplet for once. It's not from a couplet-based poetic form, which a lot of the more prominent Persian and Urdu forms are. It's from a longer sort of narrative poem called Pesik Ki Philosophy, which is a satire on the concerns of the wealthy. By a poet called Nazir Akbarabadi, who lived just a little bit later. He was from Agra, sort of, one of the former Mughal capitals, and lived really sort of in, during the transition to colonial rule. That poem is, and you see that interestingly in that poem because he specifically calls it Pesiki philosophy, which is using the English word philosophy rather than its traditional Persian Urdu cognate falsafa, which comes from the same, is an adaptation of the same Greek word, but with a pronunciation that's more phonetically adapted to Persian and Urdu, and is how it would have been said for centuries. Instead, he inserts the English cognate. But in this poem, he goes through many of the sort of what he's sort of implying are the sort of vain and ultimately, superficial concerns of the rich, but writes, what greater gardens and parterres are there than this? Narcissi, wild roses, and jasmine are blossoming in the garden beds. There are pool fountains and reed screen curtains in the pavilions too. Here and there the chatter of doves and nightingales. And again, I mean, here we have a few other elements added, but it's the roses and the jasmine. In this case, he says nazreen, which are usually, wild roses or musk roses of some sort, rather than, the large pink double damasks or modern hybrids. But still, it's this pairing that, with here the narcissi added, that encapsulates the idea of the garden, the idea of sort of a fancy, affluent person's garden. And even though he sort of meant it to some degree as satire, just wanted to pair it with this particularly precious painting from produced during his lifetime in just a bit further north in the foothills of the Himalayas, at the court of Chamba, again a very small regional court, where we just have this sort of absolutely jewel-like scene of the local prince with his sort of courtiers sitting in a flowery, delicate pavilion with reed screen curtains, with a fountain, and he's holding a narcissus, and along the bottom of we have these neatly laid out little flower beds with alternating pink roses and and jasmine. Specifically, it's quite detailed, specifically Jasminum officinale, most likely the quote-unquote common jasmine, which is, in the colder climate in the mountains is what would have been replaced the more tropical jasmine varieties generally grown in the plains. And, just to round it out with an example from the other end of the geographic end of the Persianate world, I also wanted us to have a small example from the sort of Western Persian world, from the late Ottoman Empire. So here we have a Arabic poem, or the opening rather of an Arabic poem by Yusuf al-Asir al-Husseini, who was a scholar and poet of no particular fame, but documented enough that we have his work from Ottoman Damascus, who is writing very much within the Arabic literary tradition, but rather than the Persian one. But you can see how a similar imagery persists. So he writes, "My love is like a splendid garden. Of every splendor, there's a pear in him on either side. The cheek is a rose, and jasmine his frown." This what the jasmine exactly is likened to is a bit tricky here. Literally, it says frustration. So I from the context, I took it as frown. And the narcissus, his eyes, and the chest grapes, and the saliva, nectar sweet like the choicest honey. How much healing is there in him for the heart of one who has lost his head, or who's crazy with love, is Walhan, the rhyme word that he ends on. Again, the pairing of rose and jasmine, it's not coincidental that he's putting them together in his description of the beloved's face. What is very typical here of the Arabic tradition, and what you don't normally see in Persian or in the South Asian languages, is the verse about the saliva. That's a very that's an image that works in the classical Arabic tradition, but one that clearly the more Eastern Persianate languages didn't take out on, that wasn't aesthetic in those cultural contexts. But we still see the connection with the rose and jasmine, and with the sort of floral description of the beloved. And then again, sort of going with the image here, we have an Ottoman decoupage page. It's older than the poem, but it's sort of it's part of a very of an art form that was quite popular in the Ottoman Empire, these sort of floral decoupages. And this one is it's faded, but it's very botanically detailed. And we have 5 sprigs of damask roses, 4 buds and 1 flower here, and then along with a violet and a French marigold and a blossoming Judas tree bud, and then some sort of squill, we have a little sprig of, again, common jasmine, of that, again, our standard pairing. And given the sort of striking the body of the beloved as garden imagery of that poem, and its sort of fruit elements, I just wanted to bring it back right again to the other end of the Persianate world, back to India, to another poem from the Braj tradition, from that sort of more Indic vernacular tradition, by a poet named Ras Khan, which we have very little validated details about, but he became somewhat of a saintly figure in a particular Hindu religious tradition. And according to the hagiographies of that community, he was actually born a Muslim of Afghan descent, who lived in Delhi, and fell in love with a boy, or a young man, that apparently, who was Hindu and son of a merchant, who apparently wasn't receptive to his attention, and someone who sort of saw his misery of unrequited love. And this is a very stereotypical story in a Sufi South Asian Sufi context. So this is sort of represents, interestingly enough, a Hindu tradition adopting this. In any case, someone supposedly advised him that, if he can't get the love of his human beloved, he should turn towards this Hindu god and make this and devote this devotion instead to this Hindu god. And so he apparently moved to the main pilgrimage center of the Hindu god Krishna in Vrindavan, just to the southwest of Delhi, and spent the rest of his life there, and eventually joined this particular devotional tradition and became one of its prominent poets. And a lot of, as is quite typical for that tradition, a lot of his verses are sort of written from the perspective of the female companions of the god Krishna when he was a youth in this region, supposedly. So the gopis, the cowherd girls that he was dallying with as a young man. But this poem, again, takes this, arguably very Persianate mode of, in this case, not describing the beloved's body as a garden and in vegetal terms, but actually has the beloved, the gopi herself, describing herself as that garden. As you can read here, what gardens are you going off to, darling? Just sitting here, I will lay out a garden and show you. My heels are blooming like pomegranate blossoms. My arms are two champa branches. That's a fragrant type of magnolia. Blossoming on my chest, juicy lemons. Lifting my veil, I can feed you grapes. The relish of the juice of dates and the passion of flowers. And there's some word play here, because ras in Ras Khan's name means juice or relish, as well as poetic enjoyment. I can give to be plundered. So this is quite a saucy poem here, both in the implication of jealousy of like, oh, what other gardens are you going off to? I'm the only garden you should be giving attention to, and to sort of obviously erotic imagery of the sort of floral and fruit imagery, images of juiciness that the speaker is likening her body to. But coming back to Jasmine and roses, we've looked at a number now, a number of verses from our various traditions. In the South Asian context, what's one thing that's sort of important to note is the sheer variety of jasmines, and by this at this point I just mean things in the genus Jasminum, things that we would that we consider true jasmines. And South Asia as a whole is sort of a botanical hotspot for this genus. A relatively large percentage of the wild species occur there. But jasmine has also been such a mainstay of South Asian horticulture that of the more commonly cultivated of those species, there are many garden strains. So as we will see, South Asian languages actually, distinguished with very distinctive terminology between different varieties, specifically of Arabian jasmine, and then also have different terms for various other jasmine. So on the left here we have the poets or royal jasmine, Jasminum grandiflorum, the one that's common and most common historically sort of in Mediterranean climates. The Chinese jasmine and polyanthum that is now quite common in parts of Europe that are mild enough does not figure into any of this. It really didn't make its way to any of these regions during the time that we're talking about. But Jasminum grandiflorum and Jasminum officinale are very much around. And which one of these, both of these are often referred to as Jamili in South Asian languages and North Indian languages. Which one is meant often depends primarily on climate. In the mountains where it's cold enough, it's more likely to be common jasmine, as similarly in Afghanistan and in the colder parts of Iran, whereas in the hotter regions, it's more likely, so the assumption and is going to be that it's Jasminum grandiflorum. And on the right, we have just different types of Arabian jasmine, of Jasminum sambac. There's also, a whole not other range of jasmines historically grown in South Asian gardens. A prominent example of which, just the one that I include here, is Kunda or star or downy jasmine, Jasminum multiflorum or pubescens historically, which I include here only because in some South Asian literary traditions, this jasmine also appears quite often because, again, it is associated with that god Krishna. And unlike Jasminum sambac, which flowers primarily through the hotter parts of the year and the monsoon, Kunda blooms in North India, at least in the colder part of the year. So it's sort of the winter counterpart to Jasminum sambac. And then with the roses, we similarly sort of have to look at what people actually mean by roses, what roses they actually had. So, we'll talk about musk roses in a little bit, which are sort of, wild roses, which are sort of a separate thing. But throughout most of this literary realm, most of this cultural realm, when people just refer to roses, the vast majority of the time, and as well as when they depict roses in the visual arts, what they really mean are damasks, the damasks that would be grown for rosewater production. So forms like Genti petala or Kazanlik, or here I have, just as an example, another one that I grow, Gloire de Gilan, and then to some degree later on in Iran as well, we start seeing portlands like the Resht. I mean, again, these are roses that are now relatively commonly grown in Western gardens as well. And really for the Ottomans in particular, in Iran, probably because it's the original origin of damask roses, as where they first selected, and also where rosewater cultivation was sort of has been the most continuous. There's a relatively great genetic diversity of these sort of agricultural rosewater types of damask roses, whereas virtually everywhere where the Ottomans went, it's specifically to Genti petala or Kazanlik. Kazanlik itself being the Ottoman name of a Bulgarian village known for its commercial rose growing, which was started by the Ottomans, and which is where the trade name for the variety was taken from. But this is this is the rose that the Ottomans sort of took everywhere in the early modern period for commercial rose cultivation, commercial rose oil production. So this is the one commercially grown in Saudi and in Oman and in sort of various pockets, and Turkey, and various pockets around the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa for rosewater production, historically at least. And then in India, this also is the predominant idea of a rose until the 19th century. What happens in the 19th century, sort of in a colonial context, is that newer rose hybrids start spreading. But the ones that sort of become popular are, interesting enough, really ones that maintain the olfactory profile of these older damask roses. So the sort of most common standard, definitions of a rose, kind of roses in South Asia, become primarily Grus anteplitz, which is a Geschwind hybrid from the 1890s, which is mostly bourbon with a bit of additional China thrown in, but really maintains a very strong damask smell, but with a much darker, like pink, and sometimes, depending on the weather, almost purple hue. And this really becomes the rose for garlands, for floral offerings and shrines, and also increasing for using cosmetics and in garnishing food and so on. Similar Rosa Edouard, which is considered sort of the original bourbon hybrid, a cross of a China and a damask, maintains a very damask-like smell, but can flower perpetually and is fairly heat resistant. So this becomes the standard garden rose, sort of kitchen garden rose of South India in particular, to the extent where in South Indian Dravidian languages, it is often referred to as a panya rose, a rosewater rose, because it's the only sort of rose that's commonly available that actually smells like rosewater, which would have been imported from colder climates. And again, sort of quite closely associated often with sort of Muslim cultural contexts. And then lastly here, I just included Kakinada Red or Maggie, It's sold under both names. Kakinada, again, named for a town in South India where it was collected as a found rose. But this being another bourbon which originated in Europe but became a very common garden rose in India, as well as in a number of other sort of tropical and subtropical places around the world. But it's also, as you get, this picture is actually from my garden. It's also a very, very grateful and abundant rose in New England. So coming back to the poetry and to the sort of wealth of different jasmines in the Indian context, I just wanted to look at two short excerpts from these lengthy garden descriptions from what are known as masnavis in Urdu and Persian. It's also a Persian literary form, but it's essentially a narrative poem of indefinite length in couplets and rhyming couplets. So because you only have to keep the meter and the end rhyme of the couplet, they lend themselves to telling stories. And in Urdu in particular, while they're used for all sorts of things, including sort of historical reports and whatnot, what they really become identified with are these book length, sort of adventure romances, especially by the end of the 18th century, as Urdu sort of establishes its literary canon. So I have two examples here from the 1780s and the 1790s. The first one is what probably the best known Masnavi, Sihr al-Bayan. It's by a poet known by the name of Mir Hassan. And the second one is a slightly later one known as Masnavi Dil Pazir, the heart-pleasing Masnavi, by Sada Diyar Khan Rangin. Both of these poets were from Delhi and spent their later life in Lucknow, a bit further east. Again, like Jur'at, they made that same move for patronage. Both of these are taken from extended, as in multiple page lengths, descriptions of gardens in these respective book length narrative poems. And that's not that every single one contains those, but this becomes a very common trait in the early modern period of South Asian lengthy narrative texts, that they will include these, what I in one paper called a garden set piece, these ekphrastic descriptions of gardens and sometimes architecture for the sake of reveling in the detail and aesthetics of those sites. So again, these are just sort of from the whirlwind catalogs of the wealth of flowers grown in these gardens, but quite representative of the actual repertoire of elite horticulture in South Asia at the time, and to some degree even today. And I've just, as throughout of the quotes, I've bolded all of the references to different types of jasmine and roses. And as you see here, the ones that are not translated are all in the English, are all different types of Arabian jasmine that have their own distinct names. And how these, just to give you an idea of how these sort of work etymologically. So motia, for instance, which you see there, it says poet's jasmine in one place. So poet's jasmine, again, is Jasminum grandiflorum. And then motia in another. Motia is a sort of small single or semi-double form of Arabian jasmine. Motia means pearl-like, from moti, pearl. Then we have raibel, which means like the king creeper or royal creeper. So this is a more vigorous, larger variety. And mogra literally means mace or club. So that's a form of, the sort of set of forms of strains that are generally known as Grand Duke of Tuscany in the modern Western horticultural trade, with sort of much larger, very fully double flowers that are, especially in the bud form, they do kind of look like the sort of, mythological maces that, especially of the Hindu god Hanuman. And then Madanban is like means something like the lover or the in the forest or something of that. So again, sort of referring to the creeper nature of the flower and its sweetness. it'd be lovely, obviously you see there's all sorts of other flowers asserted, mentioned here too. And again, these descriptions go on much longer than this. I just picked sections that were particularly dense with jasmine and rose references. And, here again, I also included the musk rose in the part of the images, because musk roses are mentioned here. And they're sort of, they're always listed separately from, and they have separate names, both in the Persian terminology, they're nasrin or nastaran as opposed to gul. Whereas in South Asian languages, they're either using those borrowed words, again, nasrin or nastaran, or they're sevati, which is sort of a Indic derived term in contrast to gulab for rose. But at the same time, if you read sort of more lexical entries, it is clear that people understand them to be related. They are basic, that musk roses are essentially understood as a type of rose, even though they're always terminology wise they're treated separately. And then I kind of wanted to do a bit of a similar exploration with the sort of diversity of jasmines, going back a bit further in the literary history. So here we're sort of in the, we're not quite in the early modern period. We're in the Middle Ages. We're in Sanskrit in a religious text, the Bhagavata Purana, sort of an extended text on all the exploits of the Hindu god Vishnu, of which Krishna, the devotion to which we've already mentioned, is a form. And here we have the scene in this verse where, again, these gopis, these cowherd women with whom Krishna has romantic and sexual relationships as a young man, are searching for him in the forest because he suddenly disappeared on them. And in the poem imagines them, asking all the plants, where he's gone, if the plants have seen them. And again, the plants that we have are the tulsi, which is a holy basil, which is very closely associated with Krishna, and then we have 4 plants with pale fragrant flowers, 3 of which are jasmine species, and the last one is a Indian creeper, Aganosma haney, in the wolfsbane family. But again, similar, a white flowered very fragrant creeper. The reason I chose to include this, to look at this, is that there are paintings of it, and there's this one that I've included here, a particularly stunning one. Again, late 18th century, from one of these hill courts from either Gulor or Kangra. So this was, been neighbors essentially of Chamba, where we'd seen the previous portrait of the prince with his courtiers of the roses and the jasmine. And in this particular depiction, even though there are 4 creepers, 3 of which are jasmines mentioned in the text, it's interesting that the artist interpreted, chose to interpret specifically the basil is there. You can see it here. One of the women is bending down to it, but he specifically chose to include 2 types of jasmine. Based on the text, one of which is the jati, which is the one that in the later vernaculars we would know as chameli, the poet's jasmine, so Jasminum grandiflorum, which he depicted quite realistically, even if the flowers are spaced, very much too regularly. But he has the divided leaves and the slight pink tinge and the shape of the flowers, and also even a kind of how the plant climbs or rambles up the tree. And then the almost more interesting one, because this really speaks to how localized this was because he was in the mountains, is that he reads Utica as the very distinctively yellow, shrubby, not climbing Jasminum, or now Chrysojasminum humile, which is a yellow Himalayan jasmine, which is a shrub. and especially the way the bunches of flowers sort of stand at the end of the shoots is, he captures that quite beautifully, even though it's such a minute detail. This is not what Utica usually is identified with. In obviously with a language as old and text as old as Sanskrit ones, it's not always 100% clear there, but generally it's assumed in the sort of subtropical lowlands, it's assumed to be Jasmine auriculatum, which is a climber with white flowers. But this artist here, based on his local garden flora, clearly chose to render it as the Himalayan yellow jasmine. And this is just, again, these two types of jasmines, for photo reference. And this sort of like what jasmines or are they even jasmines are actually meant is something that I've really, I've had to explore further at times, because I would read these texts and they would throw up things that at first seemed quite confusing. So one thing that I kept finding in references that I kept finding in Persian texts and then in Urdu ones as well is the colors associated with jasmines, or jasmines will come in these colors, be white and yellow, and be like, okay, there's yellow, there are the yellow ones and they're the white ones, and then some of the white ones even have some varieties with more cream colored flowers. But then there would also always be purple or violet ones. And this didn't quite become, and this didn't really become clear to me until I realized, and this lovely Iranian drawing from the 17th century here by Shafi Abbasi at the British Library was part of me making that connection, that in Persian, lilac is Yas benefsh, or in older texts, Yasmine benefsh or Yasmine kabud, meaning purple or violet jasmine. And you think like, okay, I mean, they are distantly related. But why jasmine and lilac? What is sort of the connection here? And that was quite unclear to me until I was like, well, this also seems like kind of an odd looking lilac if you're used to the common lilac or even the East Asian lilacs now dominant in Western gardens. But the standard lilac species in, again, the Persianate world in Iran, Afghanistan, and South Asia, until the late 19th century, was the Persian or cutleaf lilac, Syringa laciniata, which is a small to medium-sized shrub with often divided leaves and these very small clusters of, purple flowers with 4 petals, like lilacs generally do. But then the common jasmine in the temperate parts of the Persian-speaking world throughout the medieval and early modern period was also Yasminum officinale, the common jasmine, which very, very often produces, even though it's not standard, very often produces 4-petaled flowers. And when you compare those two, both in terms of foliage and in terms of the flower shapes, you start seeing that the cutleaf lilac really does kind of look just like a purple version of Yasminum officinale. So botanically, they're treated as a set throughout, medieval and early modern Persianate text. And it's specifically a text that we have here is from the Irshad Az-Zira'a, a gardening manual, the most elaborate medieval Persian or early modern Persian gardening manual that we have, which was written in Herat, in what is now Afghanistan, in 1515. And it only has, it has this one section on jasmine, primarily on their propagation, and also mentions some of their quote unquote medical qualities in humoral medicine. They are hot or moderate, and they like a lot of fragrant things. They're considered strengthening to the brain and respiratory system. And then we have instructions how to propagate them. And in the instructions for the propagation, you do actually see kind of a distinction being made between the purple and the white and yellow, because the white and yellows actually, are true jasmines, whereas the purple is the lilac. And then also with the fragrance, the white jasmine is being singled out as being fragrant, as being, I think, particularly fragrant, and it's mentioned that it's a climber and that it's grown on trellises. But in general, they are treated as one category. What you also will notice here is that there is actually, even though it is a technical manual, there is a verse inserted, sort of celebrating the beauty of the jasmine. The conceit there, a very common one, being that the jasmine, but interestingly, because it's a gardening book reversed, is this sort of competition between the beautiful ones, or the beloveds, and the flowers of the garden. Usually the flowers and trees in the garden are beshamed because the beloved or beautiful people are more beautiful than them, or have a better figure, are more fragrant, or etc. than they are. Here that's been reversed because it's actually about the flower. So all the beautiful people are actually like very worried and jealous and sort of scatter away in shame because the jasmine, the flower clusters of the jasmine are so beautiful and fragrant. And for some reason here I wrote saffron. This should read jasmine. My brain must have been on saffron when I was typing it out. So due to the arrival of the jasmine. And just for a little bit of reference, this lilac, lilac as jasmine, lilac as purple jasmine, does actually get mentioned in the memoirs of the early 17th century Mughal emperor Jahangir, when he described, on his various descriptions of what he was up to in Kashmir, when he would summer in Kashmir. He discusses that lilac is, and he calls it purple jasmine, is abundant in Kashmiri gardens, and that the almond blossoms and peaches sort of open the spring. They're the first things that bloom in spring, and the lilac is the thing that blooms at the very end of the spring. And then we have Constance Villiers Stewart, who wrote a actually quite fascinating book in 1913 called Gardens of the Great Mughals. She was the wife of a colonial official at the time and was quite upset about the landscaping plans for Lutyens' New Delhi. She thought that they were not in touch enough with local horticultural tradition. At least that's what she partly posits as her motivation for really doing an in-depth study of the surviving Mughal gardens. And she discusses, one of the gardens she discusses is the Nishad Bagh in Kashmir, along with all the other major historic gardens in Kashmir, which was originally the garden of Jahangir's Iranian-born brother-in-law. And she observes that it still has its Persian lilac planted, and she talks about how it's tradition in Kashmir to go view the lilacs in the spring, and she describes how they're sort of planted in these, because they're low shrubs, they're planted in these sort of dense thickets that with path through them, so you can really immerse yourself in them. And the interesting thing is that this seems to have, from what I could tell, never having made it to Kashmir. It seems like this tradition has mostly disappeared, and like the Persian lilac itself has mostly disappeared, if anything, replaced by modern common lilac hybrids. But there is one shrine associated again with a Sufi sort of teacher, Sufi saint that migrated from Iran in Hyderpora, a neighborhood of Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir, that is known specifically for having one of these Persian lilac gardens. So the two images here, are showing that in bloom, and you can sort of see that tradition. They are still surviving of these, this sort of fields of these low Persian lilac shrubs. That apparently used to be quite common across Kashmir, but for some reason now it seems to have been reduced to the shrine, in part apparently because it's specifically the lore of this Sufi saint that he brought the lilacs with him when he came from Iran. The other thing, unfortunately, is that this neighborhood, because it's it's sort of, I guess, a bastion of traditional Kashmiri religiosity, has seen a lot of unrest, and has sort of been seen as has been targeted by the Indian state as being a center of Kashmiri separatist resistance, which has at times also affected this shrine. And then I just wanted to draw our attention again to the image, briefly the image we started with, as well as one from the westernmost end of the Islamic world, where the Persianate influences are perhaps more tenuous, of just the comment that that the white jasmine is grown on trellises, and we see that reflected in the in the very clearly common jasmine, Jasminum officinale, illustration in the manuscript that we opened with, where it's the somewhat stylized but still clearly identifiable, including the the 4 versus 5 petaled flowers. Jasmine is grown on a wooden frame, and then this early 20th century picture of Jasminum grandiflorum on a wooden trellis sort of arbor in a courtyard garden in Morocco. Coming to an end here soon, but just again to sort of really explore how many things a rose can mean. This is a passage that I just couldn't give up including. It's from a Persian lexicon written in Delhi by a Hindu courtier who was a scholar of Persian and a prolific writer, and also much to my enjoyment, he's been a very abundant source for me in my work. Clearly a passionate gardener himself, Anandaram Mukhlis. So among his works is this lexicon of Persian literary usage, but he really uses the defining of words as an occasion to talk about many things, including his interests, and one of his interests are garden plants and like correct, proper identification of garden plants. So this passage, which I'm not all going to read out, but is his discussion of his and his social circle's first encounter with a China rose. So a hybrid, perhaps even based on this description, perhaps even Old Blush, the one that I've pictured here as the illustration, or a very similar one, because he describes it as pink and double. But it being a rose that, unlike the common roses, again, this would have been the masks for him, can flower repeatedly. In fact, can flower all year round in a subtropical climate like Delhi. And then he says that because of that, it's called Sada Gulab, which is combining an Indic prefix Sada, which means always, perpetual, and Gulab, this Persian-derived word for roses that actually means rose water. And then because he's writing in Persian, and at least thinking that he's writing for a transnational Persian-speaking audience, he actually has to explain, as I've had many times when explaining Indian material on these matters to people with a knowledge of Persian, that in the Indian context, gulab actually doesn't mean rose water, but just rose. And that he's not doing this because he doesn't know his words, but because he's trying to reflect the local usage and the local knowledge. But point being just that this, China roses, in some, we still have the, ones, the term of the Bengal roses in older horticulture usage as well in Europe. And so clearly, there was the colonial trade through specifically Eastern India, through Kolkata, was definitely part of their route to Europe from China. But they also sort of, in the 18th century, seem to have been making their way around India on their own. And while they themselves didn't necessarily become the dominant roses, they definitely did become, again, because they lacked the fragrance that was sort of the core hallmark of a rose, they did become known garden plants, and they acquired this, this name of the perpetual rose, or the always rose. And then lastly, just to bring us back to a similar image to the one we started with, and to the opposite end, again, sort of bringing us further west, bring us back to the Ottoman Empire. and to our, to another illustration of the same text that we saw in that first image, Wonders of Creation, Ajaib al-Makhluqat text. This one is an Ottoman Turkish translation of that text, but again, it's paired the entries on jasmine and roses on the same page. Interestingly enough, it's rendered the jasmine very, very stylized, but in yellow. And the text, says again, they come in white and yellow and purple, because it's again, sort of including the common jasmine, the yellow Himalayan jasmine, and the lilac. Although it's interesting, it'd be an interesting question if the Ottoman writer who just translated the text actually recognized that, because Ottoman culture, common lilac being native to the Balkans, Ottoman Turkish actually has its own word for lilac, which is leylak, which is where our word for lilac comes from. But and then the rose again as the counterpart. And I just want to end again on another reported text, a descriptive text. This is from a short note that was published in a larger sort of book on the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century by Jakob Ensle, who was the first foreign head gardener at the Ottoman court from 1794 to 1802. And I had to include him here because he's from the same area, and he was from the same area in Germany that I am from. He came from the town that is the county seat of the county where my parents live in Germany. And it's just kind of remarkable that someone from sort of, a normal background in that town ended up quite young too, like in his 20s, as a head gardener at the Ottoman court, and was for a number of years responsible for the private gardens of the Sultan and his harem, and then eventually went back to Germany and had a horticultural career in this town where we lived there, and then later in life essentially wrote a little report which was included in another author's account of the Ottoman Empire. So this is where this comes from. And again, he says that in the palace garden, the sort of the main horticultural feature he describes are these arbors and pergolas, which have trained on them, again, common jasmine, then, two new exotic introductions, the blue passion flower and the snail wine, and then various types of roses. And then he, describes the water basins and sort of marble, marble channels and fountains. But again, there's a few additions that have come in, but it's still the pairing of the jasmine and the rose that is sort of the backbone, even at this relatively late stage, and with all these exotics coming in, of the most elite garden in the empire, as it were. And even with an exotic gardener brought in, he he also describes in the anecdote that he was he grew the first pineapple at the Mughal court for them, because that was all the rage at European courts, and the Mughal court, at the Ottoman court, but the Ottoman royal family was not convinced of the pineapple. They were like, this is too sweet, but they did really like the cucumbers he grew for them. And I wish that report was longer, but that's sort of those are sort of the anecdotes he gives. So I will end here. I hope I left us enough time for questions. I know I've ranged quite far, but I hope this was at least a fun start for some discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. That was a great talk, and I think a really excellent addition as well to the terms seminar series, because we've had talks before, which I'm thinking of Rebecca Armstrong's and Brent Elliott's, which talk about the kind of, let's say, the literary meanings of the garden as a whole. But what happens here, which is really, really nice, is that it's not about the structure of the garden as a whole, but we're seeing specific flowers and the way that they are used, I suppose, as sort of metonyms for qualities around the garden. As you said at the very beginning, representations of the garden and ideas of spring. So if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to put these in the chat bar, or if you'd like to raise your hand to ask the question directly to Nicolas, that would be excellent. I was just going to, if it's okay, I'll ask something straight up just while people put that material in. Towards the end of the talk, you were starting to more, I guess, more clearly distinguish between different varieties of roses and jasmine. And there was an example of a writer at the time doing that. What I was going to ask is does that hold through in the poetic examples? In terms of the meaning of the rose or the jasmine, where there is differentiation, or does it become a much neater style of language, let's say, just to refer to the rose as such?
It varies a little bit. So it varies, and this is one of the things that I thought why this would be an interesting thing to explore, because it varies between places and languages a little bit. So in the South Asian languages, especially with the jasmine, we see this very clear. Like you can't just, sometimes just for the shorthand, you can say, gul or gulab or va yasmin. You just have sort of a generic jasmine, a generic rose. But for jasmine in particular, there's so many terms in South Asian languages for different jasmines that it's quite natural usually for authors to refer to a specific one, and or to enumerate. What very often happens to just enumerate multiple, especially if the point kind of is describing a scene, and giving detail rather than saying something about an individual flower. With the roses, it's a little bit, you see it less, because these other roses kind of lack all the qualities that you need to be the literary rose. So the literary rose is assumed to generally be, to be a fragrant pink damask. And that's also the rose that gets represented in painting almost all the time, which is kind of why this Delhi author, Mukhlis, why he has to go, into such detail kind of and gives like a whole story, basically trying to explain how his social circle sort of encountered and approached and like came to classify and understand the China roses because they lacked a fragrance. They looked like a rose, but the fragrance wasn't there. So then is it really rose? And they came to a conclusion that yes, it is a rose. But it's not, it's the special kind of rose. It's not like the standard rose. So you don't see, I've never seen Sada Gulab, mentioned in the poem. Gul or Gulab in the poem always seems to refer specifically to the masks. Or later on, I mean, this is why I showed the sort of later quote unquote Indian roses that are all European hybrid imports, because these are roses that aren't traditional Iranian damasks anymore, but they can take up their mantle because they're still pink, they're still double, and they have the fragrance. So these really replace the damasks almost entirely, like outside of commercial like rose growing for cosmetics or perfumery in India. Now they're being replaced by modern hybrids too, but for most of the 20th century, these were sort of the dominant garden roses in South Asia.
Yeah. No, it was I think it was quite early in the presentation, there was I'm thinking in the translation, where there was a reference to the rose and poet's jasmine. And it was I thought it was an interesting thing of the generic and a more specific, and how that was being used sort of direct.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering whether there were sort of these common.
I think it's because it's not in the context, it wouldn't have really been seen as a generic. Like there would have been one idea of what the rose was. And the poet's jasmine, is sort of my translation to get, it does just say jasmine in the original language, but again, in that context. Oh no, here it does. So if it was this one, here it
Yes.
does. The chameli is a specific, specifically the poet's jasmine, or if you're, if you're in the mountains, probably the common jasmine. But I was trying to sort of get the level of specificity that I think was there for the poet in terms of what they would have known.
That's good. There's a question here from Catherine. I don't know if Catherine necessarily wants to come on screen to ask. Pauses for a second. She writes, well, she says, thank you for such an interesting insight into two such popular plants. I see that the tuberose is mentioned a couple of times in the 18th century. Does it have as much significance? And how early was it mentioned?
Um, I'm not sure I can give a definite like first mention date. I'm not sure I've found that, but I would say I would say from the later 17th century. It seems to be around in South Asia at least. I'm not so sure about Iran or the Ottoman Empire. Um, Again, more tropical climate, it would have been an easier plant. There's a little bit confusion here because a little bit uncertainty here, because the term that ends up becoming the sort of literary name for the tuberose in all of these traditions for most of this period was also used previously for stalks. Because more fragrant at night. Like the name shabu literally just means night fragrant, or night fragrance. So, the term is around much earlier, but it's most likely referring to stalks or wallflowers. In most of it. So it's really, you need a bit of description, or a bit of contrasting context to make sure it's referring to tuberoses, which in these verses is there. Which is where I've translated it as tuberose. It is clearly established solidly in South Asia in the 18th century, because then we also start seeing it in paintings. It doesn't really acquire a symbolic notion, like it doesn't get, being an introduction from the New World, it doesn't really get incorporated into the symbolic language. Like the rose, and I didn't really talk about that, but the rose can represent like the beloved in the garden because it's beautiful and ephemeral and thorny, so sort of thought of then as standoffish, and unaware of how ephemeral its own beauty is. So it's sort of a standoffish beloved holding court. The tuberose doesn't acquire those sort of cultural meanings. It is sometimes again in later 18th century poetry, because it stands so perfectly like at attention if it's well grown and is in the garden bed, it's likened to a servant girl holding a tray of perfume, which a few other flowers are too, but I think that that sort of image, works particularly well for the tuberose. It also, in more popular culture, in Eastern India and Bangladesh, again mostly in a Muslim context, it eventually becomes kind of what lilies are in some parts of the West, where they're sort of typical funeral flowers. So there's a bit of a some people have in Bangladesh and whatnot have a negative association with the sort of heavy fragrance because of the fragrance of funerals. Because it's sort of, and it's interesting because in parts of in part of the sort of Catholic world, it comes to, in Latin America and Southeast Asia, it comes to fill in for Madonna lilies. So there's a similar sort of trajectory to fragrant lily and potentially ambiguous emotional associations with fragrant lilies.
So I suppose then it's a bit too recent in a way to have assigned a singular meaning or to have adopted any sort of significance in Islamic terms, but more sort of regional variations and associations.
Yeah.
And I think isn't I mean, I'm sure I've seen references to the rose also, but I think this might be more of an Ottoman thing in terms of its reference to being upright or sort of rigid in a way.
Uh, in the sense of being, again, because of the thorniness being
I think that was
haughty
it.
or
Yes.
inapproachable. Yes, it's also associated with sort of purity in the sense that it's especially in the Ottoman context and somewhat the Persian context, it's very, in a more religious sense, it's very closely associated with Muhammad. So
Mm.
there's an idea that it's made, it arose from this, like a popular tradition that arose from the sweat of Muhammad. In modern Iranian usage, damask roses are distinguished from rose more generically by the term Gul-e Muhammadi, so Muhammad's rose. So that association with like ritual purity, spiritual purity, is also there. Although um, that's not particularly that doesn't seem to be particularly prominent in South Asia. I mean, rose water is very much part of sort of a more Islamic inflected hospitality and cosmetics and so on. Um, but there's less of a concern with the flower representing something spiritual rather than like erotic in the poetry.
Right. Shahrazad has posted a question. I don't know if you would like to come on screen, Shahrazad.
Go ahead. Thank you, Jesse. You can read it out for me.
Oh,
Thank
okay,
you.
brilliant. She says, could you talk a bit more about the 17th century Ottoman album from Topkapi with the decoupage flowers? I'd be keen to hear more about it as a material object as well as its provenance.
So where is it? I'm just trying to toggle to it so we can see it.
Just
The
very
short
early
answer,
on. Yeah, that one. That's beautiful.
it is quite beautiful. The short answer is that we know very little about this particular one. I've never actually been able to see this one in person. I only know it from this photo, which is a photo that we have in our collection in our image collection at work. But floral decoupage was quite popular as an art form in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th and 18th century. Probably, we probably only have a sort of a tiny fraction of what was produced, and clearly quite a lot of people practiced it to like a very high degree of artistry. What are much more common in these sort of pages of just individual studies of flowers laid out are actually either entire bouquets or multiple bouquets sort of set out on a page, or whole gardens, like whole sort of side views of little garden landscapes. So the number of those from albums, most of them still in sort of state collections in Turkey. And most of them, and some of them have some like sort of fanciful coloring or representation, but most of them seem to be quite concerned with botanical verisimilitude. Like they're quite accurate and precise, and besides the flowers that we see here, I mean, roses are obviously a huge favorite. There are, but other than that, it's a lot of narcissi and carnations are very popular. And then other flowers are comparatively rarer.
Thank you.
There's nothing less left in the chat. If anyone would like to add anything quickly or let us know, that would be great. I'm also conscious of time. I think we are nearing the end of our assigned period. I'll have sorry, I've just got one more thing. If it's okay, I'd like to ask. Um, it's to do with his Persianate tradition and how that shapes the poetry. Meaning, in a sense, you refer to a lot of several examples of Hindu religion, and things that were clearly local into areas that were brought into the Mughal Empire. Did that alter, in your view, in any significant way, the kind of the poetic tropes, with reference to specific flowers or the views of the garden, or does the fact that there is this Persianate and Islamic tradition in styles of writing and styles of representation, does that sort of hold through? Maybe it might just be a sort of a language of power type of thing. I don't know.
It's a very it's a very varied picture. The easiest way to sort of describe it is that in all of these places throughout most of this time period, it is there as a reference point. It's there as part of a sort of general knowledge that that almost a certain subset of educated people have access to. And in some places, obviously, like in places where Persian is actually within this larger realm, where Persian is actually the language of the home, the language of everyday life, it might very well sort of suffuse everything. In other places, it might be a more more restricted to particular contexts. But it's that's sort of the background, that it's a tradition, a literary tradition, and a language reference that's available to some degree. How that actually plays out in practice varies quite a lot by place and by tradition. So in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, active writing in Persian peters out relatively early and quickly, which doesn't mean people don't still learn Persian so that they can read the classics and whatnot, but most actual creative production at the Ottoman sort of core and what is now, Turkey and to some degree the Balkans, is happening in Turkish, in Ottoman Turkish, but using forms and using literary images and a plant catalog and so on that are very solidly those of the Persian tradition. So the forms stay very much the same, even though the actual language, stops being Persian relatively early on. And then in the farther reaches of the Ottoman Empire, where much of the local population, including the local educated people, are actually Arabic speakers, you see the continuation of Arabic literary tradition. But this is sort of the interesting question for me: to what degree is the Persian that Persian state culture reinforcing or changing what is happening in the Arabic literature? And I just briefly, because I'm much less well versed in that tradition, I've sort of more recently come back to it, more just briefly dipped into that Syrian poet's work. But on the other hand, in South Asia, active production in Persian continues until the mid-19th century very prolifically. So people aren't just writing in the tradition, but they're writing actually in Persian, but they're often bringing a lot of Indian content into that Persian literature. So they will use the Persian forms and the Persian language to write about things that are very specifically local Indian, to describe local events, local locations, while using tropes from the tradition. But so there's a lot more. It's sort of a different interaction with it. And then at the same time, you have this other tradition, this Braj tradition that's around really from like the 14th, 15th century onwards, and it really, really flourishes in the 17th and 18th and into the 19th. That is seen as separate, and is always now treated as like a Sanskrit-based Hindu religious sort of frame, but that's very much part of courtly culture as well. And that's definitely talking about roses and jasmines and whatnot. And when it talks about roses, it borrows Persian vocabulary. I mean, it talks about a lot of things having to do with gardens, especially. It actually, reproduces the very Persianate court culture, both in what it describes and in the terminology that it uses for it. And then you have Urdu, which really arises as a literary medium. It starts showing up as a literary medium in the 17th century, but it really starts becoming like a serious literary medium in the 18th. And Urdu again hews, it's kind of similar to the Ottoman case where it hews very closely to Persian forms, and it uses a tremendous amount of vocabulary borrowed from Persian, but at the same time it's actively competing with Persian, because it's kind of the same people who would be writing in Persian that are now potentially switching to Urdu. And that process is kind of just beginning when the colonial encounter comes in. So what's interesting is that British colonial rule comes in many of the Urdu and Persian writing areas in India at the end of the 18th century. And the first couple of years, under the British East India Company, they're like, okay, we have to learn Persian because the administration runs in Persian. We have to keep, general public education to the extent that existed, and public record keeping and court proceedings and whatnot are going to stay in Persian. But then while they're doing that, they're increasingly like, oh, modern ideas of sort of language nationalism. They're really like, oh, Indians should be doing Persian is the language of Iran. Indians should be doing, that's an imported language. Indians should be doing stuff because most Indians aren't speaking it as a native language. They should be doing things in a literary form of their native languages, which really at first really buoys Urdu, because Urdu is already kind of there and it's similar enough to the courtly Persian and uses the same writing system. So then they start pushing Persian as Urdu as like, okay, this should be the local language of education and administration. But then in the middle of the 19th century, they're like, wait, no, we're the colonial rulers. We're just going to switch everything to English. And each of the religious communities should actually have a language that aligns with their religion. So then they start, for the Hindus, pushing Hindi, which is, a Sanskritized version of Urdu, as the language of the masses, and Urdu as the language of sort of the Muslim minority. So it keeps sort of evolving as well in that particular arena, based then on the politics of of colonial rule.
No, I think that's what I find very interesting always in areas of South Asian, visual culture or material culture, in this case, language. It is that adaptability and the multiple references constantly to different sort of forms that comes through the work. But with that, I think, given the time, we will draw to a close. So if everyone could join me, please, quietly in thanking Nicolas for a wonderful talk,